Hi everyone, in this set of notes we will be covering learning targets 14 through 17 in Unit 1, and this is on population ecology. With this set of notes we recommend that you use the provided Cornell Note template that looks like this. Within this template we've provided example study questions, we've provided space for filling in your notes, some fill in the blank to help reduce a little bit of your writing. We provided even templates for where you can be plugging in your graphs when you need to, and also summary space. So reminders for when you're taking notes, we recommend that you do not write word for word. Remember to summarize and use shorthand when possible. We also recommend that you use color, at least one color to emphasize key vocab terms or highlighters. You can also, or not you can, you should be sketching diagrams and flowcharts using color to show relationships between key concepts. They don't need to be beautiful, they don't need to be perfect, but you gotta at least demonstrate that you are making notes of illustrations that are necessary, okay? So let's go ahead and start our notes on population ecology. Move my face up here. Here we go. All right, so the essential questions we'll be learning about in the set of notes. What can we learn from analyzing population data? And 9, what factors influence or are influenced by changing population size? Learning targets 14, 15, 16, and 17. I'm not going to read through them, but you can pause the video to read through them. All right, so off the coast of California, southern sea otters are making a comeback. They were nearly hunted to extinction by hunters during the 18th century. Fortunately, in 1911, a treaty protected their population, and their numbers began increasing. Unfortunately, they're still at risk. They're still endangered because they have a very small habitat range, and something as simple as a single large oil spill could wipe them out. These otters are considered to be keystone species. They're important for the health of kelp forests because they feed on sea urchins and other invertebrates that eat the kelp. Without the otters, the kelp forest disappeared, and then the biodiversity also decreased. So imagine that your job as an ecologist is to study their population. You could be investigating endangered species, you could be investigating invasive species, and some of the first questions you might ask as a population ecologist would be, how many individuals of this species live here? Where else do they live? Or are these populations stable, increasing, or decreasing? This is essentially population ecology. Ecologists study populations by examining their geographic range, population density, distribution, dispersion patterns, growth rate, survivorship, and age structure. We will only focus on a couple of these ideas in this set of notes. Starting with population density. So how do you calculate and compare how densely populated populations are? So population density is defined as the number of individuals that can be found per unit area. And unit area could vary depending on your unit of measurement. It could be miles, it could be hectares, so on and so forth. And the equation that is used to calculate population density is the number of individuals divided by the area in units squared. Let's talk about an example. Now you don't need to write this down, okay? This is just an example. So say we look at Rosemount. Rosemount is about 35 miles squared, and then the number of people in Rosemount in 2018 were 24,607. So you do the math, 24,607 divided by 35.22 miles squared, and that's approximately 699 people per mile squared. Let's take a look at Apple Valley in comparison. Apple Valley is much smaller, it's less than 18 miles, and there's 54,000 people in 2018. So if you do the math, you can find that there were 3,066 people per mile squared. So the question you might ask if you were a population ecologist and if you were maybe like an urban planner or something, you'd want to know which city is more densely populated. Hopefully you recognize that Apple Valley is more densely populated in this example because there's more people per mile. Now, how do organisms disperse themselves in this area? So this is dispersion patterns. How do organisms disperse themselves in their environment? Dispersion patterns describe the way that individuals are spaced out across their range. And there are three dispersion patterns. There's clumped, uniform, or random. Let's start by exploring clumped a little bit more in detail. So clumped dispersion is when individuals live close together in groups. The reason why they do this is there's three reasons: protection from predators, access to resources, and mating. So examples of this, you can see in the picture that there are sea stars and they're clumped together on this rock. You could also think about schools of fish where you've got masses or flocks of birds. When you think about herds of zebra, these are all examples of clumped dispersion. Let's compare that to uniform dispersion. These are individuals who space themselves with a uniform distance between them. This is usually because they're territorial and there is intra-specific competition. So they are competing for space and food. An example that you see here are penguins. There are many more examples as well. This could be some types of plants, so on and so forth. Now, one thing I want to mention here, when you're writing these down, you should also in your notes be drawing little boxes and drawing little dots within the boxes to represent these. So I want to see this illustrated in your notes. You don't have to draw penguins, but you should be drawing a box with dots within it. All right, now let's compare these two to the last one, which is random dispersion. These are individuals who are spaced randomly in an area. And this occurs because all of the individuals are independent of each other. Their survival does not directly impact or is impacted by others. They are not competing for resources or space. Well, they are, but not to the point where they are like setting up a territory. And so examples of this would be when you think about dandelions or any type of plant that especially reproduces by seed or pollen. So this is an example of where plants will disperse their seeds and they will land randomly. So that's a great example. Make sure you draw that picture, please. Let's talk about population size. What determines whether a population increases, decreases, or stays the same? So population size, let's start with some basic definitions. Birth rate, obviously that's the number of individuals born in a population. Death rate, number of individuals who died. Immigration, movement into a population. Emigration, movement exiting a population. When you need to remember the difference between these, use I or into and E in exit. So what factors cause a population to increase? I need to move my face. There we go. Okay, so what factors cause a population to increase? So if the birth rate is greater than the death rate, so if we have more babies born than are dying, that will increase the population. Also, if you have immigration happening more than emigration, that will obviously also increase the population size. Let's compare that to what factors would cause a population to decrease. Say you have fewer people being born than are dying, or say you have more moving in or more leaving the area than are moving into. These would cause an overall population to decrease in size. What happens if a population is stable? It means that the birth rate and death rate cancel each other out. They're about equal, and same with immigration and emigration. Now, all of this has to do with what we see happening in nature regarding populations of species. So let's take a look at population growth curves. A growth curve is a graphical representation of how a particular population increases over time. Growth curves are used in population statistics to determine the type of growth pattern of the population. We're going to look at two types. So exponential growth is also called the J-curve. You should write down J-curve in your notes. Exponential growth occurs if population has unlimited resources. This can include food, space, there's no risk of disease, so on and so forth. And also, each generation contains more individuals than the generation before it. So I want you to think for a moment. What do you predict a graph would look like if it fits this description? Hopefully you recognize that if each generation contains more individuals and they have unlimited resources, that we would see a population size continue to increase. And here it is. So exponential growth is called a J-curve because the growth line continues to go up exponentially like a J. Pause the video and illustrate the J-curve in your notes. Let's compare exponential growth to do most populations have access to unlimited resources? Hopefully you recognize the answer is no. When you think about any type of species that exists in the wild, there would not be unlimited resources. Every population experiences some kind of limiting factor. Whether it's a limit to the food that's available, whether there's diseases present in the population, competition for mates, there are always limits to resources. So Most species do not experience exponential growth long term. And so what that type of graph is called is a logistic growth curve, which we'll be coming to in a minute. So let's talk about carrying capacity first. So these limiting factors, the limits to resources, result in what we call the carrying capacity. And the carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals of a particular species that a particular environment can support at a specific time. So basically, it's the capacity or the number of organisms that the environment can carry. Okay, so carrying capacity of an environment can also change due to biotic and abiotic factors such as seasons. So I want you to think about what's happening in Minnesota right now. It's fall, and we can see the leaves are starting to fall, plants are starting to go into, what do they call that? Oh my gosh, it's not hibernation, but they're going dormant. Thank you, dormant. And essentially, food resources are dwindling. So many of our species don't have food. So what do they have to do? So when you think about what organisms have to do if that happens, is they have to migrate. Okay, so a logistic growth curve in comparison to the exponential growth curve is when there's rapid growth in a population at the beginning of establishment. Then growth slows or kind of slows down, and growth will stop and or fluctuate around the carrying capacity. Make sure you pause the video and illustrate this in your notes. So we call this the S curve because it actually looks like an S. We have rapid growth and increase in population, and then as soon as that population grows so much that they've reached the carrying capacity, the resource limit, you can see that that line stops just around it. Now if we were to follow this long term, you might see that this might fluctuate and go back and forth around that carrying capacity. Okay, again, pause the video and make sure you illustrate this in your notes. So what do some populations have to do if seasonal changes reduce the carrying capacity? I unfortunately already answered that question. They have to migrate. So the idea here is that carrying capacity can change. So if this carrying capacity rapidly decreases, well, we're going to see a death of individuals and or they're going to have to leave and go somewhere else. All right. Let's talk about limits to growth. Let's talk more about these limiting factors. So limiting factors are any factor in an environment that controls and influences the growth of a population. Limiting factors determine the carrying capacity of an environment for a species. There are two types of limiting factors. So let's start by talking about density-dependent limiting factors. These are limiting factors of a population wherein large, dense populations are more strongly affected than small, less crowded populations. This could be because these limiting factors include competition, stress from overcrowding, parasitism or interpersonal relationships, disease, and predation. So these are all examples of density-dependent limiting factors. So when you think about it, as populations continue to increase in size, there's more competition. Therefore, it's a density-dependent limiting factor. Its influence is greater because of the density of the population. Let's compare this to density-independent. Oh, I forgot food, and food availability is also one of the limiting factors. Pause the video, make sure you've listed all of these and defined. Now let's compare density-dependent limiting factors to density-independent limiting factors. These are limiting factors that affect all populations in similar ways, regardless of the population size. So these are factors that don't have anything to do with how dense that population is. This could be environmental extremes and natural disasters, such as hurricanes, droughts, floods, wildfires. And essentially, these environmental extremes will affect a local population regardless of how many organisms are there. Like when you think about the wildfires that are happening across California, they're destroying that habitat. Regardless of whether there's a lot of organisms there or very few organisms there, it's still having the same massively detrimental impact on that ecosystem. And these density-independent factors may cause a population to crash, meaning like really crash, to the point where sometimes those populations might take years or decades or hundreds of years to reestablish themselves, or sometimes it can even cause local or permanent extinction of a species. So make sure you know the difference between density independent versus density dependent limiting factors. This is in the Quizlet that I recommend you study with. Let's talk about survivorship curves. Survivorship curves, basically, understanding the life history of a species and their environmental limiting factors is important to ecologists who are trying to study and understand and how to protect a species. So life history is the survival and reproduction pattern of a species, and we can graph the life history of a species in what we call the survivorship curve. There are 3 types of survivorship curves. Let me move my face. So first, let's start by taking a look at this graph. You'll be illustrating this graph using different colors and you'll be labeling it. We're going to start with exploring type 1 survivorship curves. So in a type 1 survivorship curve, you can see that, so if you look at this axis, it says number of individuals surviving. So we have a lot of individual organisms surviving for a really long, and this is life expectancy. So we have a lot of individuals surviving for a really long period of time. And this is because of the fact that there are very few offspring born for species of this type, and there are years of parental care provided. And so those factors allow most individuals to survive and live their maximum life expectancy. Examples of the types of species who we would classify as type 1 survivorship would be basically large mammals, primates, elephants, whales, so on and so forth. Those are all examples of type 1 survivorship curves. Very few babies are born. Mothers and sometimes fathers provide a lot of parental care, and then they live a long period of time. All right, let's talk about and compare that to type 2. So type 2, these organisms die more or less equally at each age interval. So basically it's just you die or you live. It's kind of a random chance in these types of species. And this is because there's a moderate number of offspring born, so still more than type 1, but less than what we'll talk about for type 2. So usually it's like 4 to 8, sometimes upwards of 12 babies that are born to these types of species. And there's a little bit of parental care provided, usually less than 1 year of parental care provided. Examples would be birds, small mammals like cats and dogs, and rodents. Some reptiles too here, very rare, but sometimes reptiles. And that's type 2 survivorship curve. Let's talk about a type 3 survivorship curve. If you take a look at this graph, you can see that sorry, there's a dog barking, hold on. All right, so if you take a look at this graph, you can see that the number of individuals that are born, there are lots of babies born, but very few of them survive. Lots of them die very early on in their life expectancy. And then for those who do survive, they tend to live a long period of time. So this is type 3. These, again, very few survive their first years. Lucky ones who survive have long lives. Why is this? There are lots of babies born. Instead of focusing on quality of care, these types of species focus on quantity of babies. And there's little to no parental care provided for these types of species. Examples, reptiles, amphibians, fish. Make sure you've illustrated these 3 and labeled them. I recommend using different colors. Oh, plants too. Like in this picture, it shows trees. So when you think about a plant, it produces hundreds to thousands of seeds at one time. They are randomly dispersed in the environment. Most of them won't survive or produce seeds of them on their own. All right, let's move on. Succession, we're nearing the end. So essentially, when we think about all of these things we've talked about population density, dispersion patterns, population size, growth curves and growth rate, limiting factors, survivorship and life history. So essentially, all of these factors are impacting a community structure. So the structure of a community directly impacts every aspect of a community's population. So let's talk more about this community structure. Succession is a process that is the gradual and orderly process of change in an ecosystem brought about by the progressive replacement of one community by another until a stable climax is established. It's important to recognize that ecosystems change over time, especially after disturbances. Like think about those wildfires and floods and hurricanes we talked about when we talked about density independent limiting factors. And so when we think about how ecosystems change, there's new species moving in and leaving all at different periods of time. So how does this process work? We're going to first start by talking about what we call primary succession. When you think about the word primary, it means first. So succession that is primary succession, it begins in an area where there's no biotic community currently in existence. So this begins essentially on newly formed rock. There's no soil present during this part of succession in an ecosystem. This could be as a result of retreating glaciers, a volcanic eruption that has caused everything to die and has replaced the living community with rock. And essentially what this means is that in primary succession, we need to have what we call pioneer species. Pioneer species are the earliest species of organisms that can break that rock down into soil. So these pioneer species are the first to colonize barren areas, and their job is to essentially, their niche is to make an area habitable for future organisms. So species such as lichen, mosses, and grasses build soil. Make sure you write down pioneer species and give examples. So you've probably seen lichen before, even though you can't necessarily think of it on the top of your head. Lichen is a symbiotic relationship between moss and algae, and it grows on the sides of rocks. And these types of organisms, moss, lichen, they release chemicals onto the rock that slowly degrades the rock, forming soil. So over time, once you've broken down that soil a little bit, you can start to have your first grasses and other types of ornamental flowers. Eventually you can then have, so if we take a look at this process of succession and primary, we start with bare rock. We have lichens that are slowly degrading that rock, forming soil. Then we have small annual plants, more lichens still. Then we can have grasses, because there's at least a shallow soil depth here to provide habitat for those perennial grasses and herbs. And then we've got grasses, shrubs, shade-intolerant trees, and then eventually you get to what we call the climax community. So these are shade-tolerant trees. And so the biodiversity potential continues to increase as this primary succession process takes place. But say we get to this climax community, is it going to be forever a climax community? No, not necessarily. A natural disaster could come in and completely change how this ecosystem is functioning. So primary succession takes a really long period of time. Again, it's primary, so it's the first establishment of a biotic community in an area where there is only bare rock. Now let's compare that to, what if there's a wildfire or a hurricane? There's still soil there. So we call this process secondary succession. So if there's an area previously occupied by living things and it's disturbed or disrupted, then recolonized, this is secondary succession. So again, as I mentioned, it's regrowth from the previous community, usually as a result of natural disasters such as wildfires, tornadoes, hurricanes, but also human activity, for example, deforestation and farming. So these are all examples of things that damage an ecosystem or disrupt it, but the soil is still there, and the plants and grasses still have root systems and there's seeds in the soil that can then allow for regrowth. So an example of this would be, here we see a massive wildfire. The living community is decimated, but you still have a soil base, and you still have seeds and bulbs in the soil and tubers that will allow these plants to easily regrow. And then you can see we eventually get back to that climax community. If you compare, this is maybe 150 years. When we compare it to the primary succession, that could be hundreds and hundreds of years that it takes for that process. So that was it. In and out, it was a lot, but make sure you've filled in everything. So make sure you reflect on and do your summary for learning targets 14, 15, 16, 17. Briefly define each of these key terms. Remember, you can go back and rewind this video if you need to. We have the Quizlet that has all of these vocab terms in it for you to practice, because this is a lot of new vocab. If you have questions, shoot us a message, and I hope this video was helpful. Thanks for watching.